Epilogue, wherein the epilogue of The Name of the Rose is discussed, and the text in turn forms an epilogue to this series. A few more thoughts are also provided that may be worthy of being thought. For 10 weeks now I've been dealing with The Name of the Rose. But now the story is over. That's it. End of line. End. Basta. Amen. Yes, amen in the truest sense of the word, one is tempted to say. But wait, it's not over yet. While the mysteries were solved and the object of desire, the novel's MacGuffin, was found, Eco didn't want to dismiss his readers without writing an epilogue. Let's take a look at this epilogue and end the series with it. The epilogue is not a direct part of the plot. Adson only gives some short reports about what happened after the abbey burned down. There's also no more direct speech, but philosophical thoughts. We learn that the library burned for 3 days and nights before the flames found nothing more to burn and died out. William and Azzo make their way north. Due to further political events, they go to Munich, where they separate. William gives Azzo the glasses that Nicholas made for him, and the two go their separate ways. Azzo doesn't know what became of William. He reports that years later he was again at the site of the abbey and visited its ruins, where he actually found remains of parchments from the library. He took them with him, but on closer inspection found that they were only fragments that make no sense without their context. With this, Azzo writes he wants to leave behind the paper he has filled up with words. I'll go and leave this paper. I don't know who it's for. I don't know what it's about either. And that's the real end of the story. Depending on the edition and the translation, there might be other epilogues that illuminate aspects of the novel. For example, the history of its origin or the context. In both adaptations, the epilogue is incorporated in the end. In the film, William and Azzo ride off from the abbey, and after a few yards, they meet the rose one last time. Not a word is said, but the deeds speak for themselves. William rides on, while the rose holds Azzo's hand to her cheek, but he finally follows his master and leaves the girl behind. Then we hear Azzo's voice for the last time as an old man, who reports that he has never regretted his decision. Again, he mentions that the moment he and William parted way, he got the glasses. But then he admits that he never stopped thinking about the girl. But I never found out who she was, nor did I ever learn her name. Interestingly, the last Latin quote from the novel then appears on screen, although it remains untranslated. Stat rosa pristina nomine, nomina nuda tenemus. One way to translate this could be, all that's left of the former rose is the name, we're all left with bare names. We've said something like that before, but I wanted to be sure. The film then ends with music by James Horner, which suitably releases the viewer back into everyday life. In the series, Azzo learned from Anna that the rose is still alive. Of course, he immediately goes to her shelter in the forest, but she is no longer there. She also left behind a poetry book he brought her on one occasion. Azzo then returns to the abbey and gathers remains from the library. So to speak, the scene described in the novel is brought forward a few years. Then there's a kindly replay of the scene from the beginning from the series, as William asks again, "Why are you following me?" The two recap events and William quotes the sentence about the rose. Azzo declares that we will return to Melk and remain in the abbey there as a monk. The two separate at this point, but William does not give his glasses to Azzo. Okay, final thoughts and summary. The fact that I was allowed to deal very intensively with Eco's work again made me realize the work that went into it and the level of detail. From such seemingly minor things as Salvatore's wrong Latin turning third horse into third of horse, putting William on the right track, up to working out the labyrinth of the library with all its aphorisms and letters. Not to mention all the references to names which I've only touched here. For example, all the connections between the apocalypse and the crimes in the abbey were all coincidences. In the end, everything fits together again. The abbey was written as a reflection of the world. Events take place similar to the trumpets of the apocalypse, and after the last trumpet, the monastery, the world was destroyed. In this respect, the last 7 days had really dawned when the story began. Now let's take a look at the creator of all these events. The name Jorge of Burgos is a barely hidden reference to the Argentine writer and librarian Jorge Luis Borges, who was considered a literary genius on the one hand, and on the other hand, he supported the military coup in Argentina and the dictatorship that followed, which earned him the accusation, probably not unfairly, of being a reactionary. Interestingly, he wrote a book in which a library not only plays a major role, as in The Name of the Rose, but the main role itself, La Biblioteca de Babel, the Library of Babel. Babel should not be confused with the biblical place of the same name, as travelers to many fictional places will note. Babel, a city of unknown location, is famous for its library. This library, which some call the universe, is composed of an indefinite and perhaps infinite number of hexagonal galleries, separated by vast air shafts and surrounded by very low railings. From any of the hexagons, one can see interminably the upper and lower floors. The distribution of the galleries is invariable. 12 shelves, 5 long shelves per side, cover all the sides except 2. Their height, from floor to ceiling, scarcely exceeds that of a normal bookcase. One of the 3 sides leads to a narrow hallway which opens onto other galleries, identical to the first. To the left and right of the hallway are 2 very small closets. One is for sleeping standing up, the other is a toilet. A spiral staircase and a mirror complete the furnishings. Men infer from this mirror that the library is not infinite. If it really were, why this illusory duplication? On each shelf are 35 books of identical format, 410 pages long. On each page are 40 lines. On each line 80 black letters. Because the orthographical symbols are 25 and because the library is infinite, all that can be said in any language is here on a printed page. Everything. The minutely detailed history of the future, the autobiographies of the archangels, a faithful catalogue of the library, thousands and thousands of false catalogues, the true story of every man's death, the translation of every book in all languages. Generation after generation of librarians wander through the library in an attempt to find the book. People live in this library. Borges also describes how different groups of residents of the library deal with it. Sects were and are being founded, some of which go as far as deifying the mostly indecipherable books, and others call for the books to be burned. There are wanderers who go through the library on the search for a book with the answer to all questions. There are scholars who deal with the structure of the library and many more. In Borges' story, the people in the library grow old without having found an answer to what was bothering them. This library is the most radical intertextuality in itself. Borges argues very mechanistically. Since a text is just an arrangement of symbols, all you really need is all the symbols and an infinite amount of time and space, and by rearranging the symbols you can create all the texts that have ever been written and will be written. The infinite monkey theorem goes in a similar direction, which states that an infinite number of monkeys who own typewriters and have an infinite amount of time have at some point all the texts in the world written, including works like Shakespeare, just by randomly pressing the keys on the typewriters. Borges even cites something that we find familiar from the name of the rose. All knowledge accumulated in the library eventually repeats itself. Jorge of Burgos says something similar in his sermon, in which he recalls that the task of the monastery's library is not to find new knowledge, but to preserve the old knowledge, since there is no new knowledge, only a wonderful repetition. So, is everything that simple? No, not really. And for the sake of intertextuality, let's move on to a completely different story that also explores the issue. However, the author comes to a slightly different conclusion. We're talking about the book The Neverending Story. And I have to go back a bit here as far as the plot is concerned, because what has ended up in common knowledge, thanks to certain films, does not do the story justice in any way. The Neverending Story begins when a shy, slightly overweight boy named Bastian Balthasar Bucks comes into possession of the book of the same title in an unusual way and reads it. He is told the story of Atreyu, who is tasked with finding a cure for the sick ruler of the imaginary empire Fantasia, the childlike empress. Otherwise, the realm of fantasy will be destroyed by the so-called nothing. As the story progresses, it comes out that Bastian is the savior of Fantasia, and he saves the realm of fantasies by naming the childlike empress. Now he's in Fantasia himself and has to rebuild all what's destroyed with his wishes and with the symbol of the empress, the Orin. Well, to make it clear, the Orin from the movie looks like that. That's not the original form of the Orin. The Orin looks like this, what's imprinted on the cover of this book. Just to make things clear. However, he doesn't notice that with every wish he loses himself in Fantasia and doesn't want to go back to his world anymore. When it becomes known that the childlike empress has disappeared, the witch Xaide schemes and persuades Bastian to have himself crowned childlike emperor. During the coronation ceremony, the inhabitants of Fantasia, led by Atreu, revolt. A gruesome battle ensues, which claims many lives and in which the ivory tower, the residence of the childlike empress, catches fire. Bastian severely wounds Atreu, but he can escape with the help of the luck dragon Falcor. Bastian swears revenge and pursues Atreu. And now we come to the point I actually want to talk about. On his hunt for Atreu, Bastian eventually arrives in a strange city. Around noon, Bastian came to a high wall that stretched across the heathland. Beyond that lay a wide basin shaped like a shallow crater, sloping ever deeper inward. And this whole valley was filled with a city, even though it was the craziest city that Bastian had ever seen. All the buildings seemed haphazardly thrown together, as if they had simply been poured out of a giant sack. There were neither streets nor squares nor any recognizable order. The buildings themselves look strange too. Stairs that lead to nowhere, windows instead of doors, buildings that are completely upside down, and so on. The residents also seem strange. They don't talk but do meaningless activities. Dig holes and put burning candles in the holes, and something like that. When Bastian is speaking to these people, who are of different genders and ages, they do not answer him. But someone else replies, a little monkey named Argax, who introduces himself as the city's steward. And what's the name of this city? Bastian asked. It doesn't really have a name, Argax explained, but you could call it, shall we say, the Old Emperor City. The Old Emperor City? Bastian repeated, worried. Why? I don't see anyone here who looks like an old emperor. No? The monkey giggled. And yet all those you see here were once emperors of Fantasia in their time. Or at least they wanted to be. Bastian learns that all of these people wished so much while they were here that all their memories of the real world were lost. And finally Orin couldn't grant them any more wishes. Now they have nothing more to say. But Argax has prepared a game for them. A group of townspeople have dices with letters on them. They roll the dice and then write down the letters that come together in random combinations. What Bastian sees, however, is mainly a rather senseless string of letters. Argax explains, they can't talk anymore. They've lost the language. That's why I came up with this game for them. It keeps them busy, as you can see, and it's very easy. If you think about it, you have to admit that all the stories in the world are basically just 26 letters. The letters are always the same, only their composition changes. Words are formed from letters, sentences from words, chapters from sentences, and stories from chapters. Sounds very familiar to the books of the Library of Babel, doesn't it? Bastian and Argax look at what the residents of the Old Emperor City wrote down, but as noted, it's a pretty meaningless arrangement of letters. Argax says, yes, that's usually the case, but if you play it for a very long time, for years, then sometimes words come up by accident. Not particularly witty words, but words at least. Spinach cramp, for example, or brush sausages, or collar lacquer. But if you keep playing it for 100 years, 1,000 years, 100,000 years, then in all probability a poem will come out of it by chance. And if you play it forever, then all the poems, all the stories that are possible at all must come into being, along with all the stories of the stories and even this story in which we both are talking. That's logical, isn't it? Through Bastian's experiences in the old Emperor city, Michael Ende differentiates very precisely between two methods of inventing stories. One is the mechanistic side, which Borges also describes in the Library of Babel, simply by arranging a limited number of symbols and infinite time. Every story that can ever exist comes out at the end. But Ende also shows the opposite point. In his story, the realm of fantasy is ruled by a childlike empress who has a symbol, Oren, that she hands over to Bastian so that Bastian can use his wishes to rebuild Fantasia. The childlike empress is the imagination itself. That means the inspiration that comes to people. The stories that Bastian tells do not arise due to a random arrangement of a limited number of symbols and an infinite amount of time. They arise actively and consciously in Bastian's imagination, and Oren brings them out. This is the difference between the Library of Babel, which mechanically calculates everything that can be from a combination of limited signs, and a genuine inspiration and imagination. Because of course we have to consider that we don't have an infinite amount of time, but we have infinite imagination. Michael Ende makes this difference clear in the Neverending Story. Who knows? He might even want to hint that the inhabitants of the old Emperor city are the people who write the books of the Library of Babel. Here we see a wonderful intertextuality, how one text inspires the next, and not because someone rolled the dice or something. Eco shows a different kind of intertextuality in his novel by referring to a book that he can't possibly know, the second book of Aristotle's Poetics. The idea of putting this book in the center fits in wonderfully with the philosophical thoughts. While Eco has always said that the starting point for writing The Name of the Rose was his desire to poison a monk, I'm pretty sure the idea of using that very book made that plan really viable. Eco studied literature and therefore has a profound knowledge of literary works. He based his novel on a true story once more. What is certain is that Aristotle intended to treat comedy in his Poetics after tragedy and epic, the content of the surviving text, as can be seen from the introduction. But the part about the comedy is missing. In generally, it is assumed, based on the list of works of Aristotle made by Diogenes Laertius, in which 2 books of Poetics are mentioned, that Aristotle did in fact write the second book, but that it has been lost over the centuries. At the same time, the novel is highly philosophical and touches on many facets of different topics. So there's this abbey that's supposed to be holding a convention on the poverty of Christ and the poverty of the church, while right below said abbey there's a village where real people live in real poverty. It's about love, not just in terms of Azzo and the rose, but beyond that, especially in terms of the relationships between some of the brothers. And it's about truths, certainties and humor. And again, Jorge of Burgos, who sees himself as a divine tool and doesn't even realize how contradictory his truth is. On the one hand, he demonizes Adelmus when he confesses. On the other hand, he stirs up Malachias' jealousy so that he kills Severin. But the security that this truth is supposed to give also needs fear. Fear of the devil. Because that's the only way, in Jorge's eyes, you can be sure if you know exactly if you're going to heaven or hell. Laughter, however, destroys the fear and with it the thing that gives Jorge security. Shockingly, the following paragraph from Kroeber's book on the background of the novel, although it was written and published in 1985, is quite timely, even for the country mentioned. But of course, not only this. Umberto Eco shows what the systems of security lead to, be they national, cultural or ecclesiastical. They lead to death, to murder in the name of the truth that threatens the security of the system, to the destruction of all life. Our times, especially here in Brazil and in the Brazilian church, confirm in part the sinister character of this security thinking. It fatally legitimizes oppression and is inevitably intolerant. The consequences are the suffering of the oppressors and the suffering they induce in others, the realm of cheerlessness and the reign of the nights of bad news. For example, if we look at the current situation in the United States, Jorge of Burgos would really enjoy it. Again, it is about too much piety and also about hiding certain books from people. Perhaps Jorge would even laugh with joy if he could witness this. What a thought! What a farce! But there we have a problem. If we try to use the Bible to argue against the supposedly faithful Christians, it gets nowhere. In religion and with so-called holy scriptures, you can read everything into it and everything seems to have its legitimacy. That's why such a book is a bad guide for real politics, but more and more attempts are being made to integrate exactly that into politics, if necessary, at the expense of certain groups of people. The Name of the Rose also showed that this works very poorly. One of the plot lines of the novels is the debate that the papal delegation wants to have with representatives of the Franciscan order about the poverty of Jesus Christ. The debate boils down to the question of whether the clothes Jesus wore were his property. It is interesting that representatives of the Church have actually always started to have such debates on how to interpret the Bible and the word of Jesus when they were opportune and suited them. For all the rest, it was said that one had to take the Bible literally. In the course of thousands of years, a few interpretations have emerged that, if you take it seriously, state the exact opposite of what is actually in the texts. And it is with these interpretations that we struggle today. Secondly, it is interesting that there's a debate going on about whether Jesus owned clothes or, God, forbid, even had a purse, while the topic that is actually at stake is cleverly masked. Should the Church be poor? Is this institution setting a good Christian example when it accumulates lands and other riches, adorns churches and altars with gold, and dresses its high officials in the finest fabrics? If one follows the historical context of the debate, which really took place in the 14th century, one finds that the official church regarded the ideas of the poverty of the church, which the Franciscans, for example, persecuted, as downright blasphemous. What went wrong? Actually, one has to say fatally that this discussion and interpretation fits seamlessly into a series of, shall we say, creative interpretations of the message of Jesus. The debate about the poverty of Christ was neither the first nor the last to be conducted. We in the 21st century stand only at the unfortunate and temporary cumulative endpoint of all these debates. What William of Baskerville expresses in Eco's story applies almost every time. There's often a small step between religious ecstasy and madness. Let's start with the creation of the Christian Church. I have to pull out an image that might surprise some, namely the sequence from the film The Life of Brian by the British comedy group Monty Python, in which Brian hides on a ramshackle balcony while fleeing the Romans. The balcony collapses and Brian lands in the midst of a gathering of messiases, all proclaiming their good news, to a greater or lesser extent. The picture is indeed correct. At the time, the region of what is now Israel was being ruled by the Roman Empire, and many people there who were of Jewish faith believed this to be the end times. But with the end times, the Messiah was also to appear. Because of this, there was a veritable Messiah flood in the region. with many trying their best to be a religious leader proclaiming the imminent coming of God's kingdom. So, poor Brian ends up in this round. He's the son of a simple woman from Jerusalem and an officer in the Roman garrison. Everyone around looks at him expectantly. When he is initially silent because he doesn't know what to do, the Roman guards become suspicious. So Brian has to pretend to be one of the messiahs who also has some message to announce in order not to attract attention. Luckily for him, he had just been present at the Sermon on the Mount by this certain Jesus guy and is beginning to reproduce some parts that he overheard there. But instead of simply listening to him, the citizens present begin to discuss with him. What was meant by that? What was meant by this? Are you saying that the birds are scoundrels? And so forth. As the Roman patrol approaches, specifically looking for Brian, Brian begins to repeat a conglomerate of quotes that he somehow overheard from Jesus. Blessed are those who convert their neighbor's cattle, for they will become very rich and they will sit, and they alone will one day, and only they will receive, one day will be given to them. When he realizes that the Romans have not noticed him and are marching on, he ends his sermon with relief, not realizing that with these sentences of all things, he has finally caught the attention of his audience. As he comes down from the wall he was standing on, he's asked what will be given to the people he was just talking about. When Brian refuses to answer, the crowd comes closer and demands to know what's going on. Is it a secret? Is it the secret of eternal life? The last thing he needs is the attention he's getting by doing this, so Brian flees. On the way out of town, he trips and loses a sandal. However, he does not stop to pick it up, but keeps running. When his pursuers arrive at the sandal, we witness, as one historian put it, the history of all religions in 2 minutes. First, a person comes into play who is just called Dennis in the script. Dennis sat next to Brian on the wall as he preached. Brian was carrying a gourd at that point. He became the owner of it through some adventurous and awkward means. And since Dennis liked the gourd, Brian gave it to him. Dennis became suspicious. What's wrong with it if it's just given away? A woman from the crowd now takes the gourd and announces enthusiastically that from now on people will carry the master's gourd. And second, people pounce on Brian's sandal and proclaim it's a sign. Immediately, however, an argument breaks out as to whether this is a shoe or a sandal and what this sign means. Should everyone take off their shoes and collect them, or what? Well, now, 3 fractions emerge. The gourd believers, the shoe believers, and the sandal believers. But that's not the end of it all. Brian continues to flee and arrives at a place where a hermit is sitting in a hole. The hermit has taken a vow of silence, but when Brian accidentally steps on his foot, he screams in pain. His vow of silence is broken, and the crowd takes notice of the two. A series of events now occur that Brian's persecutors misinterpret as miracles and only increases their devotion to the supposed Messiah. Then, when the hermit angrily attacks Brian because of his vow of silence and a few other things, he is labeled a heretic and carried off by the angry crowd. We don't see what happens to him, but since everyone is shouting that the heretic must be killed, we can imagine. So in this sequence, we see a few features that we can also see in the Christian religion and in other religions, condensed into a few minutes. The simple messages at the beginning are picked apart and discussed by the crowd. The rather vague and chaotic messages at the end receive special attention since everyone can project what he or she wants. The cryptic messages lead to a transfiguration of the master. Everyday actions and objects, the gourd, the shoe, are charged with symbolic meaning. Formation of a sect, since not all followers can agree on one interpretation. Despite the formation of sects, anyone who does not recognize the supposedly true Messiah is a heretic and must be killed. The emerging Christianity actually had the need from the beginning to reinterpret the traditions. At its core, it is actually a Jewish end-time sect that expected the return of Jesus after his crucifixion, and thus the coming of the kingdom of God within the lifetime of the direct followers or only a few generations later. But that didn't happen. Isn't it embarrassing that the end-time sect had to keep pushing back the date of the end of the world and has been waiting for it to finally happen for almost 2000 years? In fact, that is why the revelation of John, the so-called Apocalypse, anticipating the end of the world and the coming of God's kingdom, contains so many allusions to historical events and personalities of the time. There was a reason why the beast, whose number is 666, was seen to reflect the Roman emperors who persecuted the early Christians, or why Rome was identified with Babylon. The work was probably created sometime between the years 60 and 70 AD and gives a picture of the state of the world at that time and the first Christian communities. Friedrich Engels, for example, says about the interpretation for the modern age that the prophecies of the Revelation have now lost all meaning except to simpletons who may still be trying to figure out the day of judgment. However, as an authentic picture of almost primitive Christianity, drawn by one of their own, the book is worth more than all the other books of the New Testament combined. If we recall, Umberto Eco also addresses this problem in The Name of the Rose. So, after no judgment day occurred during the lifetime of the first generation of Christians, the number 1000 suddenly appeared, derived from the 1000-year kingdom of God, which is mentioned in the Apocalypse. Only now the 1000 years have been pushed back to a time before judgment. Alternatively, the end times should be 1000 years after the birth of Jesus, 1000 years after his resurrection, or as Jorge of Burgos thinks, 1000 years after the first ecclesiastical council of Nicaea, held in the year 325, which sets the events of The Name of the Rose really close to an apocalyptic date. As the year 2000 approached, such thoughts arose again, particularly in fundamentalist churches, but as we have noted, the end of the world was once again called off. The problem that the Bible has is the problem of any great work involving different authors, especially over a period spanning centuries. It is not uniform. There are innumerable contradictions and the respective sects solve them in their own way. For example, Jesus says not to worry. The birds neither sow nor reap, and the Heavenly Father does feed them. But the Protestants refer to the Apostle Paul's second letter to the Thessalonians, which says, "He who has no will to work shouldn't eat either." This was shortened to "if you don't work, you shouldn't eat," and is still used today as an argument against the so-called welfare state and social assistance. The sects that preferred to follow the gourd wanted to be particularly pure, and then carried this spirit to the so-called New World, to America. As a result, the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism were combined, and this brings us back to the core element of The Name of the Rose, as well as contradiction and problems that still plague people today. The theme of the conference in The Name of the Rose is poverty, and the new ethics, particularly value, was placed on the fact that those who do not work should not eat and have no right that others help them. This is a reverse conclusion to the teachings of Jesus, but as always, the interpreter says Jesus was misunderstood with the things about wealth. Jesus wasn't saying that accumulating wealth is inherently bad. Accumulating wealth is only bad if you rest on your wealth and do nothing more. Now today we have some millionaires and billionaires where one thinks, enjoy your wealth and stop upsetting or even damaging society with your absurd idea that you now can implement because you are filthy rich. And the attitude about not resting on your wealth can be an explanation why millionaires and billionaires do those ridiculous things. Speaking of you, Elon Musk. Well, some are maybe just drunk with the power that money gives them. If you quote to the people who propagate the dogma of riches blessed by God the corresponding teachings of Jesus, which reads, "It's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to go to heaven," these people sometimes reply with a forgery that predates the time of the events of the novel The Name of the Rose. You may have already guessed it, the argument is misunderstanding. Jesus, they say, did not speak of camels and real needle eyes. The eye of the needle was the nickname for a particularly small, narrow city gate in the city wall of Jerusalem. When camels arrived there fully loaded, they couldn't fit through. So, if you wanted to enter the city here, you had to take off the load of your camel, and the camel had to kneel when passing through the gate. That's what Jesus meant, it is claimed. Not all wealth is bad, but one should lay down the burden of wealth temporarily and kneel. That is, to be reverent. And then one will go to heaven. Yes, for the Christian rich and super rich, this is certainly a beautiful story and calming one's conscience. The Elon Musks and Bill Gates of this world got lucky again. So, everything alright? Or what? No, not really. Yes, it would be a nice story, if it were true. In fact, the claim that the Eye of the Needle was a historic city gate in Jerusalem dates back to the 10th century. Before that, there is not a single source that proves that anyone, especially during Jesus' lifetime, could have thought of such a gate when the word Eye of the Needle was used. And just as the sentence is in the Bible, Jesus should have assumed that everyone listening to him would understand the allusion without further explanation. Otherwise, he would have used a simile. So it's literally about what it says. A camel can't fit through the eye of a needle, just like a rich man can't go to heaven. All very chaotic and contradictory, but life is chaotic and contradictory. It must also be remembered that at the time when these books were written, life was much simpler. It isn't anymore. At the lifetime of Jesus, nobody knew anything about the fact that there was another continent just on the other side of the ocean, where there were also people. Today, on this continent, there's a country that directly or indirectly influences the whole world. Times are changing, and the simple rules that were possibly, well, good for something back then must be replaced by rules that do justice to the complexity of life on Earth in the 21st century, and not by claiming authority by appealing to an old book, but with democratic means. Religion always wants to give security. Do this and you will go to heaven. Don't do this or you will go to hell. But living in a democratic society means being able to endure insecurities sometimes. Elections, for example. You can clearly see that in the Republicans in the USA, who still do not accept that Trump lost the presidential election. Already they are working on the myth that the next election, well, if Trump takes part and loses again, will be rigged. As it is in the Middle Ages, they hinting at the presence of an evil force intent on fighting the Republicans. But incidentally, the patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, Cyril I, uses a similar argument to justify the war against Ukraine, a war of aggression from Russia that doesn't fit in at all with the peacefulness preached by Jesus. Again, it goes against the forces of evil, which justifies everything. But how is William of Baskerville saying it in the film? The only evidence of the devil's presence is everyone's fervent desire to see him at work. After a trip to the USA, the French historian Alexis de Tocqueville was enthusiastic about how democracy and personal freedom and individualism are made possible there. But he also distinguished individualism from egoism, and it is the latter that we are seeing more and more in the USA today. The argument that demolishes all other arguments is once again, I have the right religion, you don't. In this respect, we really have a situation like in The Name of the Rose, which can be seen almost symbolically. The Franciscans and the Benedictines face each other irreconcilably and discuss. Much depends on the outcome of the dispute, although most of the people who will be affected are neither involved nor possibly even aware of it. And at the end of the day, it's not about having a real discussion, it's about defending dogmas. There are complex problems in the Abbey, the series of murders, for which simple solutions are sought and supposedly found. If we delve even deeper, we also notice that politics is the same as in that Italian abbey. Jorge of Burgos put the right people in the right places, which he could manipulate at will. We see something similar today, for example, the composition of the Supreme Court in the USA or the military in Brazil, which were actually supposed to enable ex-President Bolsonaro, who was voted out of office, to stage a coup. And if we're not careful, this dogmatism, like in The Name of a Rose, will end up setting the world on fire, virtually and literally. Of course, what has also been mentioned again at this point is the embedding of the story of The Name of the Rose in a historical context, which Eco reproduces very well. And as we've already seen, he also brings some light to some historically authentic figures, such as the mystic Ubertine of Casale, who was fiercely critical of the popes, Michael of Cesena, a general of the Franciscan order, Bertrand del Poggetto, a cardinal who lived in the papal legate for northern Italy at the time in question, and last but not least, Bernard Gui. The portrayal of the characters may not always be completely historically accurate, but as a reader of a novel, you have to be prepared for that. After all, the story wants to convey a message. If you want to know exactly what happens, you should turn to a scientific work. The film is limited in its adaptation to the core elements of the novel and shifts the event a bit to climb a Hollywood-esque climax. After all, the questions of poverty are illuminated and the strangely dubious role of the church, but it's only a few scenes. For example, we see how the farmers pay their taxes and in return receive a blessing from a clearly annoyed monk, or how the villagers help to push the papal delegation's car up the road to the abbey, while the members of the papal delegation, wrapped in fine clothes, look bored out of the window. As for the death, the motive remains, but much of William's intellectual labor is lost, and the fact that he twice finds out something by accident is actually something what Sherlock Holmes author Sir Arthur Conan Doyle definitely wanted to avoid, and since William is a pastiche on Holmes, a little more ambition on the part of the screenwriters would have been good here. Many small traces and hints are lost in the film script, which is a pity, but probably not feasible in terms of time. But the fact that Severine's and Malachias' death doesn't even mention the trumpet of the apocalypse anymore is, in my opinion, a mistake in the script. For the viewer who is not familiar with the novel, it must seem like the murders now get out of hand and no longer follow a pattern. But that's the point, they never followed a pattern. Except that all the poisoned people read the same book. Only William thought he got one. Nevertheless, there's also a lot that is well adapted in the film. For example, the realistic depiction of the Middle Ages or scenes that are not literally taken from the book, but implemented something from there in a different way. In this respect, I can already say that in my opinion, the film is the stronger adaptation of Eco's work. It's just, as the opening credits say, a palimpsest, a reworking where you still can see the original. Now a few words about the series. As I said, I think the film version is the stronger adaptation, and that has a lot to do with the changes. The series revolves around two diametrically opposites. On the one hand, whole passages are taken verbatim from the book. On the other hand, they are extremely different from the original. Unfortunately, the additions are not always as skillful as in the film adaptation. Sometimes the series really drags on, and that Azzo and the Rose see each other regularly somehow doesn't go together. Moreover, the lack of a village at the foot of the abbey eliminates the contrast between rich and poor that is so well portrayed in the film and reflects the dispute at stake. The Rose has been given a different background to accommodate a contemporary message. She is no longer a poor girl from the village, but a war fugitive. Of course, that also fits in well, because the normal population only felt the effects of big politics back then without being able to really have a say in what happened. But the Rose as a poor girl in a village below the abbey, while figuratively speaking that those up there in the abbey are discussing the poverty of the church, was intended to represent precisely this contrast. This leads to the plot of the series becoming untidy in my eyes, where it could have used a little more focus. I haven't found an official report about it, just a few rumors, but if they are true, then the series was a very personal project by John Turturro, and that he wanted to make it for years, and he wasn't happy with the result either, suggesting that some of the changes were made at the objection of studio bosses or, well, other bosses. If that's true, I feel for Turturro. It's a real shame to see how it ended up being when you're imagining what it could have been. And because of the way the adaptation was done, one big effect is simply gone. In the whole story, there is only one woman in the original novel. But as soon as she gets to be the focus of the events, she's blamed for everything bad and arrested. That was also a thought that Eco wanted to process. A community of men who direct the fortunes of the world, for whom women are at best accessories and at worst witches. Just to bring the story to the present, how about Prince Harry from the British royal family and his wife Meghan? The so-called tabloids have focused on Meghan as the witch. You can't call it anything else. Everything the newspapers deem bad that Harry does or says is presented as if it was all her evil influence, as if he were under a spell and had no will of his own. And just like in the novel, all the inquisitors have long since passed their verdict, each one a Bernard Gui who wants quick results and therefore doesn't bother too much with facts. One has to imagine that the year 1327 in this year was 696 years ago, and in some parts our society has somehow not progressed. The big difference is that the sentencing is now taking place on a larger stage. The condemnation of the Rose in 1327, as William puts it, would have provided a brief spectacle somewhere along the road between the Abbey and Avignon to impress the local population. Today, that roadside is the internet. But people are as small-minded as ever. But back to the series. How could one have approached the adaptation in the way, for example, with the strong female role in the form of Fra Dolcino's daughter Anna? Well, maybe you could have worked out a contrast with flashbacks. We leave the monastery as it is, a community of men, and no Anna threatening a Bernard Gui with a sword. But whenever Remigius thinks back to his time with Fra Dolcino, one can see the contrast. Here, the strict, regulated life in the monastery among men. There, a mixed community of men and women who do not want to submit to these rules. Something like this could work particularly well if, in the present, the monks are talking about the depravity of women and Remigius remembers his life with the Dolcinians, where there is no sign of depravity. This would also provide a reason why Remigius secretly smuggled women into the abbey at night. Incidentally, the series has also taken an artistic liberty with Bernard Guy. It is shown that he was the inquisitor at the trial of Fra Dolcino, but that is not true. Guy has passed many verdicts, but the verdict against Dolcino was not his. Now, what about my feeling about the ending with the stakes and all that? That's still here. The problem is that I can't say for sure whether the ending of the novel would have been better without the stakes, nor can I offer an alternative that would have gone a very different way. So I accept it as given. Also because I like Remigius in the film adaptation saying, "The devil I renounce, that is you, Bernard Guy," excellently delivered by Helmut Qualtinger. Well, that's it. These were my reflections on the novel The Name of the Rose and its adaptations. But how did it turn out back then when I was dealing with the work for the first time? Well, I wrote the article for the school newspaper, it was published, and that was it. No resonance. So at some point this work disappeared, as did the second book of Aristotle's Poetics. Well, at least until today. From studying the novel, watching the film and series, and reading the secondary sources, I realized that the story hasn't lost any of its topicality. However, as far as Umberto Eco is concerned, there is still a downer. Eco was disappointed that his debut work received so much attention and was even made into a film, but the novels that followed were not. In fact, the topic of the following novels have an even clearer contemporary reference. Maybe I'll take a closer look at them somewhen. However, I have to say the same about Michael Ende's book The Neverending Story, because there is so much more to the book than was processed in the media. Well, the intertextuality breaks all chains, so to speak. After The Name of the Rose, Eco wrote the following novels: Foucault's Pendulum, The Island of the Latter Day, Bodolino, The Mysterious Flame of Queen Loana, The Cemetery at Prague, and Numero Zero. Let's see what I can make of it. Well, there's so much else too. A work by Eco that is once again highly relevant these days is his essay on the subject of Ur-Fascism. Here he lists 14 general characteristics of fascist ideology, arguing that it is not possible to organize them into a coherent system, but that it is enough that one of them is present for fascism to coagulate around it. He uses the term Ur-Fascism as a general description of various historical forms of fascism. The 14 general characteristics are as follows. Number 1. The cult of tradition, shaped by cultural syncretism, even at the risk of internal contradictions. When all truth has already been revealed through tradition, no new learning can take place, only further interpretation and refinement. Number 2. The rejection of modernity, which views the rationalist development of Western culture since the Enlightenment as a descent into depravity. Eco distinguishes this from a rejection of superficial technology advances, as many fascist regimes cite their industrial potency as evidence of their system's vitality. Number 3. The cult of action for action's sake, which dictates that action has intrinsic value and should be undertaken without intellectual reflection. This, Eco says, is associated with anti-intellectualism and irrationalism, and often manifests itself in attacks on modern culture and science. Number 4. Disunity is treason. Fascism discounts intellectual discourse and critical reasoning as impediments to action, and for fear that such analysis would expose the contradictions embodied in a syncretic belief. Number 5. Fear of difference, that fascism seeks to exploit and exacerbate, often in the forms of racism or hate speech directed at foreigners and immigrants. Number 6. Appeal to a frustrated middle class, fearing economic pressure from the demands and aspiration of lower social groups. Number 7. Obsession with a conspiracy and leveling up an enemy threat. This often combines an appeal for xenophobia with a fear of disloyalty and sabotage by marginalized groups living in society, like the German elite's fear of the businesses and successes of the Jewish population in the 1930s. Pure anti-Semitism, of course. Eco also cites Pat Robertson's book The New World Order as a prominent example of a plot obsession. Number 8. Fascist societies rhetorically label their enemies as too strong and too weak at the same time. On the one hand, fascists play up the power of certain elites to instill a sense of resentment and humiliation in their followers. On the other hand, fascist leaders point to the decadence of these elites as evidence of their ultimate weakness in the face of an overwhelming popular will. Number 9. Pacifism is trading with the enemy because life is permanent war. There must always be an enemy to fight. Both fascist Germany under Hitler and Italy under Mussolini worked first to organize and cleanse their respective countries, and then to build the war machines they later used, even though Germany was subject to the Versailles Peace Conference restrictions on building military forces. This principle leads to a fundamental contradiction within fascism, the incompatibility of ultimate triumph with perpetual war. Number 10. Contempt for the weak, uncomfortably married with a chauvinistic popular elitism in which every member of society is superior to outsiders by virtue of in-group membership. Eco sees in these attitudes the root of a deep tension in the fundamental hierarchical structure of fascist polities, as they encourage leaders to despise their subordinates, to the point of the ultimate leader despising the entire country for allowing him to take over the land with violence. Number 11. Everyone is raised to be a hero, leading to the embrace of a death cult. As Eco states, the Ur-Fascist hero is impatient to die. In his impatience, he often sends other people to their deaths. Number 12. Machismo, which sublimates the hard work of constant war and heroism into the sexual sphere. Fascists therefore show both contempt for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. 13. Selective populism. The people, conceived as monolithic, have a common will that differs from and is superior to each individual's point of view. Since no mass of people can ever truly agree, the leader poses as the interpreters of the people's will, when in fact he dictates it. Fascists use this concept to delegitimize democratic institutions, which they accuse of no longer representing the voice of the people. And finally, 14. Newspeak. Fascism uses and promotes an impoverished vocabulary to limit critical thinking. It makes you think how many of these 14 qualities are clearly visible in different circles today. Okay, let's be honest, it's actually all of them. It's gotten to the point where being an opponent of fascism is seen as a bad thing by some people. In order to prevent people from obtaining broad information, we are back to the watchdog who looks up knowledge in a library and wants to prevent too many people from accessing this information. Libraries and large collections. I stayed here for 10 weeks, searching through them for clues. But isn't it the case that we as a world have now achieved what Eco described in his novel? We have it, the large library with many texts. The rooms are confusing and arranged like a maze. There's a lot of good text, not so good text, and text that would have been better never written. Not because of heresy, but because these texts are full of hate and lies. We call this great library the Internet. There are even secret rooms like the Finis Africae, where very special things are kept, and not everyone can get in. However, this large library is not limited to texts or books. A whole tower is filled with podcasts, another with videos sorted by YouTube, Vimeo or TikTok. Of course, there's also a Jorge of Burgos. What am I saying? One Jorge of Burgos? Countless! These people who are so pious that from their piety grows wickedness and evil. Those who invade the rooms of this great library and declare that the room is now theirs, like Twitter for example. And they do what they want, like Jorge of Burgos. They try to prevent certain information from being made public. And just like Jorge did, they poison the pages of the book. What was it like when Elon Musk bought Twitter? Just like that. The bad thing is, the Jorges are up to mischief not only in this great library called Internet, but also in the material world. In Florida, it's already so far that books can't just be given to students, they have to be appraised beforehand. When a teacher gives out an unpeered book to his students, for example because he thinks it's a classic, like The Catcher in the Rye, Brave New World, or Of Mice and Men, he can be punished. We've come this far again. But one of the worst Jorges, I would argue, is the almighty algorithm that is playing an increasingly important role. Well, no. That comparison is not quite correct. The algorithm that determines what I get to see and where is not Jorge, but rather Malachias of Hildesheim, the simple-minded librarian, who does what Jorge tells him to do. Maybe one have to work against the algorithm through clever curating. Professor Yefimov announced his Upsilon project. We don't have many letters left in the alphabet to accomplish anything, especially after the last attempt went so disastrously wrong. But in terms of intertextuality, as someone said in another story, we'll take the next opportunity and the next until we succeed, or there are no more opportunities left. So let's see how I can move the ASTROCOHORS club forward. Each one for itself doesn't always work. And finally, intertextuality is also found here. Creators who inspire each other, from which something new emerges. Something new, I would like to emphasize, because despite all the repetition that already exists, there is always something that you have not seen, read or experienced before. And there was this interdimensional conflict. A lot has happened. Time we join forces because there are other forces out there doing just that to bring the world into darkness. The club has long relied on the spaces given to it by the corporations. Time to open a space of our own, at least here, to have a place of retreat and gathering. In doing so, we will have to remove the separation that the language barrier has brought up until now. Aren't we one world? The languages together but sorted so that everyone can find what they want for themselves. And maybe we'll see inspiration propagate again. But when we talk about the world being plunged into darkness, how can we distinguish between the legitimate concerns and the made-up things and opponents that Umberto Eco discusses in his essay on Ur-Fascism? By facing reality and looking at the opposites derived from these characteristics that Eco describes. We've already discussed that groups, people or ethnic groups, are not a homogeneous mass, but rather a collection of the most diverse opinions and worldviews. Also, what we see in the world is not the one conspiracy that certain groups always invoke. we see many different people and groups working very loosely together because they see the benefit in doing so. The fossil industry lobby would like to make profits continuously, even if they damage the environment, the climate, and ultimately the planet. Radical religious people want to impose a worldview that should have rotted long ago because they want to wield power. Oligarchs want to keep their profits, luxury, and power. Into this mix come politicians who allow themselves to be paid by the other groups for a wide variety of reasons. Money, power, you name it. It's quite a mess, and it's not like there's one leader that you just have to defeat and it all falls apart. Networks will find new figures to support them. And we mustn't ignore human nature either. Profit and power are one side, but for some it's also the loss of self-reflection or the fact that you could find yourself in an embarrassing situation if you suddenly change your mind. For example, if you have already publicly expressed yourself very strongly in one direction, only to be shown by people who really know better that you've gone astray. It's always particularly embarrassing for people to admit that. And if the opinion already expressed obeys this ominous gut feeling anyway, which unfortunately is completely unreliable, it becomes difficult. For example, could anyone imagine Elon Musk publicly admitting that he was wrong about the Twitter acquisition? That it wasn't all that simple? And that he was actively causing harm with some or almost all of his decisions? Or that J.K. Rowling admits that he lets dubious figures exploit her? You could go on like this for a long time and talk about foreign policy, the climate crisis, or Corona. It would be desirable for people to recognize and admit their mistakes and publicly change their mind. But for that, we need a new culture, a culture that recognizes that mistakes like this can happen and it's never too late to admit it. But if we take the Rowling case as an example, we can be fairly sure that she would be publicly torn apart by previous allies if she would go that way. What would follow would be far worse than what she's being accused of at the moment. Yet another factor why some people wouldn't return from the rim. What is left for us to do? Recognizing that the world is complex and that complex problems need equally complex solutions. This is a message from Eco's novel The Name of the Rose, among others, embodied very well by the contrasts of William and Bernard Gui. Critics have described the novel as a maze through which the reader must work. But such a maze is life itself. Some just don't want to explore the ways of the maze. They want to tear down the walls and find a direct route to the exit. Others want to hide certain books, claiming they were never written, and simply redefining words and concepts. They impoverish the vocabulary, as Eco called it. That is why there are terms that have been turned into their opposite, so that one can stigmatize those who still use them in the old sense. But life doesn't work that simply. And who knows? Maybe life will find a way. A good ending to a lot of intertextual thoughts. Now all I really need is, as a final bow to The Name of the Rose, a good quote at the end. And I think I have one that fits and that clarifies a question that has been on people's minds since the book first came out. The name of the rose would be Rose if the rose existed.